Hello, everyone. My name is George Abraham, and I'm the Senior Product Manager for Indigo Studio, which is our prototyping tool for prototyping user experiences. So let me just go back to my first slide. And the title of today's talk was Prototyping to Manage Change. And this change can happen for us when we are kind of retooling our applications for moving from desktop to web, or we are trying to retool our applications to move from an existing web page to a desktop website into a mobile form factor. So this change is unavoidable whether you like it or not. And I kind of classify them into these three kinds of big changes. Right? Your users have changed. The users who are using your application are using other applications also, right? So your competition is actually always trying to out innovate you, and you want to make sure that your users stay on. The second thing might have changed is the UI patterns change. Yes, there are a lot of things about user interfaces and user interactions which are fundamental and cognitive, but there are patterns of interaction which have evolved over time. So, for example, touch is one such paradigm. But for example, even if you do traditional websites which had form-based validations, now you would see that the validation happens inline as opposed to on form submit, and things like that keep changing. And you want to make sure that the user interface you designed conforms to these new ways of interacting with applications and digital experiences. And the third thing which might have changed, your business has changed, and time has gone by, and where you were 5 years ago may not be where you are today, and may not be where you want to go in the next 5 years, right? So the business process itself might have evolved so much that even when you're retooling your applications, you have to now account for all these business processes which you had relegated to some backlog because you didn't have the time or the code base was too icky for you to go and change. Now that you're planning to do this next iterations of your application or creating a new application, you would go back to that backlog and start prioritizing from there. So the talk is roughly divided into these five sections. The first thing, I'm just going to cover the basics of why should we prototype. The second is about how to prototype, some basic, very basic principles which you can follow to create interactive prototypes. The third is I'm going to introduce you to some basic prototyping skills which you would need for prototyping in Indigo Studio. Then we can talk about prototyping large applications with custom UI libraries. And this might be of interest to people who are actually working with a big application in an enterprise, and there are some patterns and styles which are already in place. And you would like to reuse them as you're creating these kind of interactive prototypes. And lastly, I'll talk about indigodesign.com, which is a place for sharing and collaborating on prototypes. Collaboration more in terms of paying it forward, designs you have created, which you would like to share with the community, which you can download and reuse. So the first thing, just to continue that thread of change is unavoidable, software is not something you take to an antiques roadshow. What that means is that things which you had designed 5 years ago, you can't just keep selling just that, right? Maybe it's a good candidate for your internet archives, but it's not something which is like a heirloom a piece which you kind of carry around. People who are not familiar with the Antiques Roadshow, it's a show on PBS. There's a link right there, and you can check out how people are kind of getting uh, some old china evaluated for its cost. Like how good it is in the collector's market and so forth. This is a truism today that it is UX season, and there's a lot of talk and a lot of content being created for user experience, what you should do for great user experience. Apple has been the leader, and how we should all emulate Steve Jobs and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, when the rubber meets the road, what you need to actually create in order to elicit feedback is a prototype, because all this other stuff which you can read about the UX process, about wireframing, about design rationale, personas, these are things which the users cannot actually give you feedback on. And in user experience, the one thing which hasn't changed is trying to get actionable feedback on the designs you have actually created. And that can only be done using some kind of a tangible artifact which kind of synthesizes your design direction, your intention, and get let people use it and try it out to give you the feedback of that nature, right? Not about preferences, but about can you do something. It is also really about shared learning, and this shared learning is not just within the team. It's shared learning which you extract with users, with stakeholders, and within your team, right? And as we think about design and as we think about application flows, we might think about it as a whiteboarding session, and that's great. And it's vivid. It has a lot of sketching involved. You talk about how a user would flow through the application. What it is not is annotated wireframes, because delivering wireframes is not really the goal of a good design process. And the problem happens is that these annotated wireframes are great maybe for talking about bits and pieces of your UI, trying to explain it to your team members or your developers who have to implement some design. But this is not something which I can potentially show to the user to say, hey, can you actually? So this is an example of I took for a calendaring application. I cannot show this artifact to the user to say, hey, can you add a new event on this calendar? Because the design is not enabling the user to process this information. What we really want to do is we want to evaluate the experience with users in use and in context. What that actually means, you stop presenting your design, right? But what I mean by presenting is that calling in this big room of people, board meetings, whatever you want to call it, and you are the star of the show, trying to explain away everything you have designed or convince somebody what the design is about. What we really want to do is instead of presenting, have it in a format such that the users could actually evaluate it on the device. And this is very true that you could have users in the room where you're doing this fancy presentation, and then you wait outside the room, and instead of presenting, you give the same application on some kind of a device and ask them to do something. They would have a very different kind of feedback than they would have had while they were just passive observers of your presentation. So context is key. So if the context is the device, you try to evaluate it on the device, right? So in essence, prototyping is all about having this idea or a design intent, and you're trying it out on your own. And for example, this is Indigo Studio is just one way of doing it. And there is this double loop which is happening. The first loop is that you had this great idea and you start putting it into pixels, trying to add interactivity and trying it out for yourself first. Because as you're trying it out, you're making these micro corrections. Things you thought were fantastic ideas are no longer as tangible or as palatable now. Once you have satisfied yourself, because you cannot keep doing this forever, right? Because we are in a time constraint, we want to move on. Once you have convinced yourself, which is of course the first person you're convincing, you can actually move on to the bigger loop where you're actually sharing what you have created into a format which the users can actually see in their context, right? Because based on that, and that's sometimes you can call it usability testing, because with usability testing, what we're finding is this new insights and learnings which we as individuals or as designers or as developers did not have because we were not domain experts, but the users are, and they'll give you this kind of amazing feedback which you wouldn't have thought, which you thought was completely sensible with the way you had done it, but the users don't see it that way. And that is the kind of feedback and insights we really want to take into our next design iteration. So we just covered why we should prototype. Now let me just give you some very basics on how to prototype. Now this is not going to be an exhaustive lesson for how to create prototypes, but I'll just give you some basics. The first thing you can actually convince yourself is you're prototyping the experience and not the application. And I'm trying to do a graphic imagery of an application is very complex. There are a lot of cells and holes to fill. Hold on one second. I forgot to turn off something. But what we want to do is we only want to prototype what's needed to evaluate the experience. So what that means is instead of trying to create that entire grid in your prototype, what you're trying to do is map out these user flows, which are of interest to the user, which let them progress towards the star refers to a user goal. So for example, you can think about your prototyping an ATM interface, right? Everybody is familiar with what an ATM interface does. You can withdraw money, deposit checks, and so on. But those withdraw money, deposit checks, these are user goals. And when you're prototyping it, you can actually find out which is the most high priority story which you want to accomplish. In this case, it could be withdraw money, and try to only prototype the experience somebody would have to, experience trying to withdraw money, right? You don't actually have to do everything that that application does, because by the time you have finished doing that first pass through the withdrawal flow, a lot of the design elements, a lot of the design decisions start crystallizing in a slightly more tangible form, right? So when you now add the second story, which is about deposit checks, you already have a foundation to build on. This also allows you, the moment you finish the withdraw money story, you can start evaluating it right away with your users and get some feedback before you start even these other stories or other edge cases or scenarios you have to think about. So that's the first thing, right? You have to think about it as task or user flows and not screens, right? So what I'm trying to show here is there's the star at the very end, which represents a user goal. And all these little dots you see are various steps or UI states or things users would have to do in order to progress to the user goal. And you want to make sure that you are trying to mimic a flow as opposed to these kind of hub and spoke kind of scenarios for which would cause you to just stick in that prototyping phase forever. So you can think about these flows as, comic books have a very similar idea where you have these panels which represent a certain point in time. The user would do something or some event happens which progresses them to the next panel, and so on and so forth. There's no reason why you cannot interpret prototyping for software interfaces or digital interfaces in a very similar manner. So this is the same ATM example I was talking about of withdrawing cash from your ATM. As you can see that it's not just one screen. When I'm thinking about these prototypes, I'm thinking about the flow which is required for withdrawing money. So in this case, I'm just showing you 4 of the possible screens or states the user would have to go through before they can actually get the cash. So in this case, I'm just showing you a pin and entry, selecting what the user wants to do, selecting from which account they want to withdraw, the amount, and so on and so forth. The second thing you need to have in place is have enough content fidelity in your prototypes such that the user can make a decision and not use generic lower ellipsis text. As I told before, the idea is to have the prototype in the hands of the user such that they can actually do something for you. So if it's a withdraw transaction, you need to make sure that you have enough text which is sensible such that the user can actually use your prototype, right? So what you're seeing on the right looks like redacted text, but that's as good as putting lorem ipsum. Because if that text does not say get cash or deposit checks or balance and statements, it does not fit the context of use for which you're building the prototype, right? So do not put lorem ipsum. Now, this might seem like a very tedious thing to do, but what I told you before, you're actually prototyping just the experience of the app and you're doing it flow by flow, right? So you're only adding fidelity to support that flow. Anything else, you don't care at that point. And the third basic thing you can put in place is have a consistent style for the user action buttons and links. Because it's an interactive prototype, you're asking people or users to do something. For that reason, you want to make sure that the action items, like it could be a button saying submit, it could be a delete, it could be a go forward or next. You want to make sure you at least have that basic style in place. And this does not cost you a lot of time to have it up front. And you do not need an expert visual designer to help you out here. So for example, here I'm showing you this one click buy might be a branded action, and you could call it a high visibility action button. There's usually only one of them on the page. The second styles are around primary action, which is like if you have a dialog pop up and you want to hit done or OK, that primary action, which is what you want the user to take, has a certain style to it. And that's the primary blue in this case. Similarly, you have a secondary action, which is like an optional path or something which the user doesn't have to take immediately, and it's always, has less visual emphasis than the primary action. And then you have actions which are dangerous actions, right? Things which you do not want the user to accidentally do. So sometimes you can use a color, sometimes you can use a confirmation state to basically help the user confirm what they're actually trying to do, and then link style and some basic typography, right? So if you can be consistent with your typography, your user interfaces which you're creating, first, it saves you time while you're planning how this thing should be laid out. The second, the user is also able to scan very quickly what the hierarchy of that particular UI is, right? So some basic styles for heading 1, heading 2, heading 3. And of course, this is like the invisible design element, which is the white space or negative space. Sometimes our designs get so crowded, just spacing things out actually implies tries to communicate more things of what things are grouped together, like things which are together. You can actually simulate that with white space as opposed to trying to add extra borders or lines to separate things out, right? So that's the how to prototype aspect, right? So 3 tenets: flows. The second thing was content fidelity, and the third thing was having a consistent style for user action and buttons. So let me show you how this actually works in terms of Indigo Studio, right? So the prototyping basics. Assume that I have done those 3 things I talked about. In Indigo Studio, there are 3 basic things which come together. One is the ability to draw your UIs using UI elements. And these are things you're already familiar with, like buttons, text boxes, tabs. Then there is the aspect of interaction, because we're really talking about an interactive prototype. So interaction could be in the form of a tap, a click, or something of that nature. And then optionally, you can talk about transitions, because sometimes when users are doing something, you may actually have to pop up a dialogue. You want to show a dialogue or minimize a dialogue, just so that the user knows what just happened and where things kind of went. When, like, for example, in iOS, when you do drill down, the things slide to the left so that back will actually slide them back in, right? So that transition actually helps out. So this is just, I'm revisiting the design I was actually talking about earlier about the withdrawal flow. And in this case, I'm just going to talk about 2 UI states in particular, right? Just to give you a sense of how Indigo Studio operates with UI states. So this one screen you're seeing here is really about that UI for letting users know what actions are available. The second screen happens after the user has clicked something, and in this case, it was get cash. In Indigo Studio, when you actually click and create an interaction, it creates a secondary UI state. And most of the time, when you're using UI states, you're only designing the changes and not redrawing the interface. And this has huge benefits, and this in terms of the speed and maintainability of your prototype, right? Don't worry, if this looks complex, I'm going to show you this exact example inside Indigo Studio. It'll make it much more clearer. So in this case, you're seeing that between these 2 UI states, 2 of these blocks were removed. The get cash kind of moves into this left panel, and these 2 blocks, which were like $60 cash and deposit checks, they were just edited to show fresh content, and which is similar to how you might actually create apps where you're reusing content blocks and putting in fresh values and things based on what the UI state is. And the arrow which is showing between is basically the user interaction which led users to proceed from that state to this newer state, which is selecting an account. And then there's the concept of the animations or transitions I talked about. And you will see that when I show the demo of the app, is that it is shown in the timeline area, and it records all the changes between the previous state and the state you're on right now. So let me just go to Indigo Studio and launch you the same example and show you one basic interaction on how these screen states are created. Let me open Indigo Studio. So this is the screen. I already got started, but I'm just going to show you how much I have finished, right? So just to give you a quick overview of the user interface, on the right side are the UI elements I was talking about, which you can just reuse. And on here are UI elements which I dragged on and gave it a basic style. What that basically means is I just grabbed on like a button, and then I can style the button a certain way, right? I can do the color and stuff. Delete that. So in Indigo Studio, which is unique to Indigo Studio and you don't find anywhere else, is as you're actually creating interactions and UI states, we start building out the user flow for you. So you will see it under this little drop down. When I maximize this drop down, you will see that I have actually modeled one, which is the enter your PIN, second, which is when you have tapped or clicked all other transactions, third, when you have tapped on get cash, fourth, which is actually selecting an amount. Now, in order to show you how these UI states work, I'm going to continue where I left off to show you how these design changes are being made, right? So I'm going to open up that one particular state by double clicking. So I'm going to minimize this toolbox just so that you have more space. And I don't need the timeline right now. Now, the user interaction I want to finish for my prototype is when you click $40, I want to ask users how they would like the receipt to be sent to them. Would they like to print the receipt, email the receipt, and so on and so forth? So for that, I just have to ask the question, what would the user do? I would say the user selects the $40 tile. In this case, I'm going to say add an interaction. When the user taps or clicks 40, you have two options here. You can either change the screen, which is what we would use to create UI states, or navigate to an entirely new page. And that might be the case if a lot of things are changing on the UI and you want to take the user to a completely different space. So in this case, I'm going to do change the screen to a new state. So it happened instantaneously, but what you're seeing in the top left, this drop down, is it's showing that the new state was actually added. This was the previous state, this is the new state. The new state is identical to the previous state, all right? But what I really want to do is show the receipt screen. For that, I'm going to make some changes. So $40 was already selected. So what I'm going to do in the left panel, I'm going to select that text, copy, paste it, put it right there, and change the text on it to $40. The select amount and that arrow here, I'm just going to move it down. And now I'm going to change the text to say select receipt. Everybody with me here, right? So now I have now on the right side, I want to actually show the receipts things. This UI has served its purpose, right? So what I can do, imagine I have three options for receipts, right? I say, okay, I don't need these guys. So I can just simply select them and delete them. This one also, I don't need it. Move this here. I can make this tile bigger. Move this here. Make that tile bigger. And I can just say, I can change this text directly. Print receipt. And email receipt. If I can spell it right. And there's some text in here which I don't need. I can just select it and delete it. Right? If I want another block, I can just select that block. Control C, Control V. And this could be my no receipt. Okay. So like I was talking about what happens in the timeline, when I show you the timeline, you see there are things which were originally on the interface, which I kind of removed. And then I kind of added new things. And the timeline is just basically reconciling what is the difference between the state you're viewing and the previous state, and just listing it out for you, right? Now at this moment, when I show you the IX Explorer, I can maximize it. You see the new flow was actually automatically added. You didn't have to do this manually. Just the fact that you added an interaction and created a state means that this was already in place. Now, if I just hit run screen, it's already a prototype. And this is showing the preview. I say all other transactions, I want to get cash from the family checking account, $40. And then you see this screen, which is what we just designed, right? And I can keep going with this flow to say that, okay, when I hit print receipt, I can say, edit this interaction, change what happens, change the screen to a new state. And this new state, what I wanted to show is some kind of a modal, right? And the modal, I can just do Alt drag and search for a UI element right in there, or I can drag something from the toolbox. So in this case, I'm just going to create a container. And the container could just say, I'm looking for a print icon. And yeah, this is the other thing you can look at. Most of the icons you might commonly need are already part of Indigo Studio. You don't have to go hunting for it, right? So I get an icon, and the icon could just say, I'm going to add a title saying printing. Same thing. When you look at the timeline area, you will see that a container box was added, and I could say, I can name this container box printing. And now when I go back to the UX Explorer, as for the Interactions Explorer, you see that printing state was automatically added. Same thing, I hit run, and I don't actually have to always start from the beginning. I can just go here and hit preview, which will only show the previous state and the current state. So I can say print receipt, and this is your modal for printing. All right. So this is how you kind of created some UI elements. And now if you want to add some transitions, as I mentioned, the change was the printing dialog was added. I can just add a duration to it, say, 30 seconds is 0.3 seconds is a good number. And now what happens if you look at it, when I hit print receipt, the dialog is actually appearing with a delay, right? So, and if I want to go even more fancier, the dialog can appear from the left. I can add an animation segment here and then move to the right. And now you see there are two operations which happened. The dialog was added first. And I'm just daisy chaining animations here. And then it was moved. So if I hit preview now, print receipt, the dialog moves into view. And that is how simple it is to actually create not only interactive prototypes, but also adding animations. Now, once you're done with this, the other basic thing you want to do is send it to someone, right? So for that, what I can do is I can just go back to my project home, select the screen which I just designed, and this screen is just one encapsulation of the flow. I can just show you what that flow looks like by saying show states. And this is what I was originally showing you in the Interactions Explorer. I can go back and say share. When I hit share, you see our share dialog, which has two basic options. One is to share it on indigodesign.com, which I'm going to talk about shortly. But this is a URL service where once you publish a prototype, we return a simple URL which you can share with anyone. It's a private server, and you have full control over putting password protection and things along that nature. In this case, I'm already signed in, right? Or you can do share on your desktop to create an offline version of this prototype, right? So for now, I'm just going to do it on our server because it's the fastest way. I said just generate link. It packs up what we just designed. And that's it. You get a simple URL. I can just click on this link directly or copy it and send it to someone. Let me click on it. Clicking on that link fires up the browser, right? And it's showing you that I was the one who designed something called withdraw flow. I could have added description so that somebody coming to this page would know what this stuff is all about. I launched the prototype, and now anybody can view this prototype on the web browser, right? So you don't actually need Indigo Studio on your machine in order to experience the stuff you have just designed. And this one is HTML, so you don't even need any plugins to run through this prototype. Right? If you want to see what area is clickable, you can just highlight it in the toolbar here. As you can see here, this one is like I had put in a back interaction to go back. Print receipt. There you go. So let me just quickly look at my questions panel to see if something happened here. All right, cool. So it seems like somebody lost audio for a brief moment, but we're back. So let me just go back to the presentation because now that I've covered the basics. So I just covered the prototyping basics where drawing, interactions, animations, and quickly sharing your prototype makes sense, right? Now let's just move on to this next phase, which is prototyping for largish applications with custom UI libraries. And this might be very helpful for people who are already having existing desktop applications and they would like to incorporate things or design patterns or design styles they already have in their application to build new prototypes. And that helps us because the users are not surprised or you don't actually have to spend the brain power trying to figure out what would that button look like or what would that style look like. So just to give you a sense, Indigo has three kinds of artifacts. One is what we call a storyboard. Storyboard tries to capture at the largest level the context of use for this particular application. And they typically include scenes and things along that nature. The second thing is what I was showing you right now was drawing user interfaces with screens and screen states. And what I'm going to talk about now is the notion of screen part, which has the concept of a reusable custom UI elements. The simplest way you can think about screen paths is a way to work faster and to work with a design language which is consistent for your enterprise apps. So the UI elements, which is what I was showing you earlier on the right toolbox, are things which we have provided with the application. So we call it our UI elements. The screen paths are your screen paths or your UI elements, and they kind of represent things which you would like to preserve for reusing across screens or would like to reuse across projects. So you can actually create some screen paths with button styles, dialog styles, which you can then share with anyone in your organization who's using Indigo Studio so that everybody is starting from the same baseline. Right? So let me show you how screen paths kind of look like in Indigo Studio. Going back to the application. Done. So, I'm also the product designer for Indigo Studio. And what that actually means is that there are a lot of UI elements for the application which I sometimes need to use to design new features for Indigo Studio. And that's very similar to the experience you might have with enterprise level applications, right? So in this case, there are buttons like right here you see run screen, which has the same style as my primary action button here. The done screens are the ones which I show on dialogues, delete, cancel as secondary actions. Then I have some basic dialogue styles. So I know there are questions, but I'm trying to multitask. So I'll try to just quickly finish this section, and then we'll definitely look at the questions at the end of this webinar. So what I was talking about is these kind of dialogue styles and which I can reuse inside the application. And how it actually surfaces itself is imagine I have this screen part library which I've already created with the headings and link style. When I create a new screen, and this is like a fresh canvas, and this is the original toolbox I was showing you. If I switch over to screen paths, you'll see these are all the UI elements which I have created from Indigo Studio as a base application, which I can just reuse directly. So if I want to show an error dialog, I have organized it a certain way, and naming can help you in terms of making sure that the search works faster. But you can also create categories inside this toolbox. So I can select any two screen paths, right click on it and say add a screen path category, right? So if I want to now show an error dialog, I can just drag the error dialog right in here. And that's pretty much what a screen path is. It's a reusable piece of content. Just because it's a screen path doesn't mean you can't make changes to it when you're using it. For example, the text you want to use for the dialog might be completely different than what you have in that screen path, which is fine because what you have dragged down to the screen interface or the designer is just an instance of that master element, right? The advantage you get is if I just say edit the source screen path, I can edit the real source of this thing and make changes to this one. So I say this button or this text has to be of a different nature, or this icon is a different icon. I can pick a different icon here. I'm just double clicking on the icon, say I pick this icon. When I go back to the screen, that icon automatically is updated. So I can change in one place and it automatically hydrates wherever it's being used. But at the same time, what I was talking about is you can do local customization. So I can select that one and add, this is my special warning dialog for this presentation. Same thing happens for my buttons. I can just say, delete this. So this is one way in which you can actually have a great level of consistency and productivity in terms of what you're actually doing. Now, you have these screen part libraries, but I haven't shown you how you create these screen parts. That's not a big deal, because all you need to do is, if you have a, like, let me just create the style again. So I say I just drag a container. This time, let's give it a green style background here. That'd be great. I add a button to the container and say special. So now I can, if I want to say that, okay, I want to keep it as my screen part, I just select that UI element and say convert to screen part. And that automatically creates a new screen part, and it'll by default be uncategorized right here. I can rename it here and say my special screen part, right? It's also open in the background. As you can see, this is where you can edit the screen part's source. And here's how I first created the screen part. Now that you have all these fancy screen parts in there and you want to use it on some other project, just like I showed you how to share a prototype on indigodesign.com, I can go back to my project home, select this folder called screen parts. I can select all I have in here and say share selected. And now what it's basically doing, it's the same share dialog, but now the dialog is saying it's share screen part library. And I can say share on my desktop, right? Because I'm not sending it to anyone. I just want to create something which I can give my friend. So what I'll do is I'm going to create it as a webinar. I'm just going to call it webinar and say generate. Let me put it on my desktop. Generate. So that's what it's doing, is actually running through all your screen parts. And I have a lot in here. I have like at least 37 screen part components. And screen parts can also have nested screen parts in there. So in this case, it's done. I say show on Finder. And now I have this one file which says webinar library, right? Now, if I start a brand new project, which I can do it from the application menu, I say start a new project. You would originally see that my screen parts is empty, right? But I can just as easily get the screen part folder, the screen part library file I just created. I say add screen part library. I say browse. So it's asking me to save. So let me just save it. So every design in Indigo Studio is saved into one single folder, and that's why it's asked me to create a project folder. And it helps to create this project folder structure is that when you create interactive prototype and you change the name on one of the files, we don't want the interactions to break. And having them all inside one project helps us refactor the prototype so you don't have to worry about rewiring it, right? So I pick a project folder. This folder can be located anywhere. So I'll just put it on my desktop. I'll name this folder webinar. Open. And now I can name the screen. I just call it test. Save. All right, now let's try to do this again. Webinar library. Open. And what it's actually doing is trying to copy all the screen parts which are present in that one library file into this new project. So if I say copy, it's done. By default, to help you be very efficient, any screen part file which is imported into a project gets put in a common location. And the benefit of that is if you have imported it once on your installation, you don't actually have to keep doing it again. It's already available in this default library folder. And by default, it's located under your Indigo Studio called libraries, right? So this is the webinar folder I just imported. I can just say import, copy, It's done. So now I've done it twice, so I don't want it. I undo it. So now when I go back to my screen paths toolbox, you see all the screen paths which were present in the library file, along with this categorization, is automatically present for me to reuse in a fresh project, right? So I can just recreate my Indigo Studio interface just as easily by just looking for stuff like toolbar, because these are things I created and I know how it looks like, prototype toolbar, and I can just quickly redo my design using those custom elements. Sounds good? I go back to my presentation. So what I talked about was prototyping these largish applications with custom UI libraries, right? So I showed you how you can create individual screen paths. I showed you how you can select a bunch of screen paths and just generate a .library file, which you can then place in a common location and let anybody else in the organization who's using Indigo Studio use that in their project. Now, there's another aspect to it. So the organizational story was really about people who are co-located or you can easily get access to. But we also have launched this new service called indigodesign.com. And the purpose of indigodesign.com is sometimes you have great ideas which you would like to put out there or help other users of Indigo Studio to jumpstart their project. So if you have created a set of libraries or a prototype which you would like to give someone else access to, you can do that on indigodesign.com, right? So let me show you what indigodesign.com basically does. So I am signed in. So when I try to share what I showed you earlier, I'm signed in already on indigodesign.com. So if I want to share something instead of the URL I just generated, if I go to indigodesign.com, you see this is my personal space, and this is the prototype I had just shared or showed with you, which is actually the prototypes which you have created from Indigo Studio are now in this private space on the web, which you can access without having to open up or fire up your Indigo Studio application. And once it's on the web, what you can do is you can add details and descriptions and tags to better organize this prototype. And with one click, I can make it available to anybody in the community. So in this case, I'm going to just say market community. And just like that, this prototype is now available to anyone to basically download, get a link to, favorite, and so on and so forth, right? So here I can also add password protection to my prototypes. I can delete my prototypes. There is much more you can do. If I show you the left navigation, once you are signed in on indigodesign.com, you get more stuff, right? You have the navigation to have marking things as favorites, creating collections. Collections could be thought about as a playlist for your prototype. So if you are working on a very large application and you've been working out on small pieces of that prototype, you could actually upload them as individual prototypes and then string them all together as one single collection. And here we are actually aggregating any tags you have added to your prototypes. Now, the community side of indigodesign.com is just another navigation item on the left. Here you can see everything people have shared with the community, right? So this is stuff which we have published, for example, the money app, right? So if I open that up, you'll see this is an example of a finance application. And if you want to see how this prototype works, so for example, if I launch it, right? And you want to see, hey, how did we do this stuff, right? How did this interactions and this transitions, how did someone accomplish this? You can actually get the source files directly because it's already in the community. I can just hit download, and that will just download the entire project for you to reuse, right? Anything you share on community really is all about sharing. So we're not looking at copyright. Everything you're publishing in the community is published under the terms of the MIT license. If you want to add more restrictions, just make sure you mention that in your description section, right? That way we always have accountability. You also get analytics for things you've shared with the community. And this analytics is available by default even on your individual shares. So for example, on this one, I say how many times it has been viewed, how many times it has been downloaded, and what does the trend look like in the last 7 days, last 30 days, to give you some sense of how active is that design you just contributed. Go back. So if you want to know more about indigodesign.com, you can just go to indigodesign.com/about, where we actually highlight the basic features of Indigo Design, which is all your prototypes in one place, organizing and curating your designs, having that dashboard view for your prototypes, and exploring designs by other users. Frequently asked questions are also answered right on that page. So if you have any questions about the privacy and what our policy is about indigodesign.com, you can do that, right? You do not have to use indigodesign.com, but it is the fastest hassle-free way for you to share prototypes, right? Because we just give you a URL. If you do share offline, which is what I'm going to show you quickly. So I go back to my other project, ATM project. I select that one screen, and now I do the same thing, share selected. But instead of sharing on indigodesign.com, I share on my desktop. And now it's all asking you to pick a folder, and let me call it ATM project. Oops, I click cancel by mistake. I say create, open, and just say generate prototype. What it basically does, it creates a completely offline version of the prototype flow, which is an HTML. So it gives you this one index.html page. I launch it. And now you can actually showcase your prototype or try out this prototype without having to rely on an internet connection because it's just running off your machine. So let me go back to my presentation. All right. So we talked about why we should prototype, how we should prototype. We talked about the prototyping basics for Indigo Studio. We talked about using these custom UI libraries for prototyping the design language, to use the design language you already have in place for your desktop applications, which you're now migrating to some other platform, but you want to have a starting point for UI elements. You can do that with screenpaths. And we talked about indigodesign.com, which is the place where you can explore designs contributed by other users or designs which you wish to contribute not only to in your private sphere where you can just go to one place and see everything you've shared, but you can also share it with the community with just changing the privacy setting on that prototype. Right? So that pretty much, hold on, let me just see if I missed anything. That pretty much ends, the session we have planned for today to give you a brief sense of how you can prototype quickly to manage these kind of changes. And prototyping with Indigo Studio is really about designing changes, right, as I showed you before. So I'm going to quickly look at some questions, and if there are some longish questions which I need to answer, I'll try to answer that separately in a different blog post. If you want to get a sense of what we just released in version 5, you can always go to our blogs, which is blogs.infragistics.com, and under Indigo Studio, you would see what's new in version 5 talking about these things. The video is being recorded, so you should have access to this presentation. And also the slides, if you like them, I can basically share them with the video, with a blog post, right? So I'm just going to quickly hand it over to Jess while I kind of scan through the questions.
All right, thanks, George. So we are going to pause our screen sharing briefly so that George can take a look at the questions that have come through. And we're going to be on the line for probably another 10 or 15 minutes. So as we go through these questions, if you can think of anything else, please feel free to ask away in that questions panel. And don't worry if we don't get to you to any of the questions that you do ask today. Don't worry, like George said, he's going to be, we're going to follow up with a blog post where we'll try to tackle the top questions that are asked during this presentation.
Yes, so the questions are, some of them we've answered. Copy of this presentation. Can you embed video? Yes, you can embed video. Right now there's a video stencil, which you can just drag from the toolbox and link it to YouTube or a Vimeo video. I do all my designs inside of Sketch. Indigo Studio is very powerful. I want to work with the existing design. All right. So of course, I mean, Indigo Studio lets you create UI elements such so that the common UI elements which you find in desktop applications, rather than you having to do them from scratch. But if you already have comps created in some other application like Photoshop or Sketch, you can perfectly drag them over and use hotspots to get access to all the interactions we have put in place, like tab gestures and things of that nature. The only pro tip I can give people when they're using full comps is don't try to import them as full comps. Instead, try to use them as slices, because that will give you more creative control in terms of doing in element or element based transitions if that is what you require. Does Indigo Studio create code artifacts? Yes. When I was sharing the prototype, the one thing which I did not show before, let me just show my screen. So again, when I say share, you see there's an option in the share settings which says enable generating HTML code assets. So let me just click on that and generate the link again. About seeing these prototypes firsthand, if you go to indigodesign.com right now, under the community section, you would see one prototype which says withdrawal flow, which I just made available public. So you should have no problem getting access to it. So now if I run this prototype, and this takes us to the landing page. Let me just launch it. And since I enabled export code assets, you'll see there's a new option in the prototype toolbar which says toggle code exporting dialog. And now you can see the markup which is available to run the UI I just created. Right now it's actually including the prototype CSS styles under the style tag. And that's showing you the markup for the state you're viewing right now. You could choose to exclude the prototype custom styles or even the default styles and copy this code and paste it somewhere, because this is basically just the markup for running that screen. The other thing I wanted to talk about was, let's see, if you want to get the code for any particular UI and you don't want to keep clicking around to get to that UI state, you can just hit this menu option on the prototype toolbar. It says show states. And that will give you the same UI I was showing you earlier for interaction flow. And you can jump somewhere deep into the prototype to basically say, okay, I just want to get code for that one. So you open that one up and see toggle the code export dialog. Right? Going back to the questions. Can I import a UI library in? Well, the UI libraries are actually created in Indigo Studio. So I first exported them, and that created this file called .library. And that is that file which we can kind of send around to use on any other Indigo Studio project. So the question is Indigo Studio suitable for just mobile apps or any kind of application? Let me answer that question quickly. Show my screen again. Let me go back to Indigo Studio. When I create a new screen, see, the certain things I clicked out of really quickly, but as you can see, there are the various form factors available. Let's see if I can collapse this guy. And you pay attention to, when I pick a form factor, check the toolbox also, right? So if I say I want to do for iPhone 6, now it's iPhone 6, right? And the toolbox also updated to do the iOS 8 pack. And I can switch between them manually too. So Essentials is what we kind of ship for desktop. Or it's kind of a neutral style. You can use it even on mobile. But if you want to do iOS specific things, the benefit of doing is that you don't actually have to worry about element sizing, right? It is just whatever Apple has suggested, the size and the height of the button, that's what it's going to be, right? So you don't actually have to worry about, is it going to fit? So if I could drag in a header, and if I drag in a tab, I'm going to just size the tab fully. Oops. You see, this stuff is just fits right in, right? But if I don't choose that, I say when I create a new screen, I pick tablet or desktop. It's completely up to you what you want to actually design for. You can do generic, which is like doesn't care, it's like a desktop application. You can do browser specific things, or you can do tablet specific things and phone specific things. I hope that answers your immediate question. So there's a question. If I want to share the prototype with a stakeholder, does the stakeholder need to have Indigo Studio installed? Not at all. The URL service I was talking to you about, it's just a browser link. So if somebody clicks on that browser link, whether they are there on the device, so if you designed an iPhone version of the prototype, you click on that link on an iPhone device, it just shows up like a native application, right? Same thing which applies for desktop applications. You don't need Indigo Studio installed. You don't even need a plugin installed to run the prototype. Uh, SharePoint screens. Yes, I mean pretty much you can share. You can create any kind of digital UI based prototypes using Indigo Studio. Right. So I think that there's a similar question here about assuming UI will be web. What about Indigo Studio prototyping for WPF action? Actually, Indigo Studio is platform agnostic. It can create whatever you want to create. So if you want to create a WPF application experience, you can totally do that by creating UI elements which are more traditional looking, like your WPF applications. Create your screen paths and just go ahead and use the interaction framework in place to create interactive prototypes which you can share. The benefit, I would say, is that you don't actually have to touch your code base. Some people might say that, hey, I already have a code base which is very mature, but the exact reason it's so mature, you don't want to go mucking around in there, right? You don't want to be constrained so early when you're trying out ideas. And the idea here is you should be able to prototype something in a couple of hours and just as easily send it to someone. So you don't actually have to rebuild a solution on somebody else's desktop for them to actually experience and give you the feedback, which is what you wanted about the prototype. Uh, is it possible to import PowerPoint storyboard into indigodesign.com? Indigo has its own storyboard capability. And I didn't show it to you because I had so much to cover. So let me just show my screen briefly. So just like I was creating screens, I could create something called a storyboard. And this is basically showing a different experience where these are just blocks. And just like we have a toolbox on the prototyping solution, we have scenes for the storyboard. So what that means is you can just drag and drop a scene onto that story step. And if you already have screens designed, so for example, these are the screens I was just designing for withdraw flow, and it automatically shows up in here. I can just drag and drop it into the scene, and it shows up on the desktop view, right? And you can narrate your story. Sam is doing doing a transaction, and I can hit tab to create a new story step and just continue that story flow. I do not have to use the scene. I can just drop in a screen directly in here, and that does the same thing, right? And you can narrate your story however you like. And anytime it's an interactive part, you can just hit run directly from here, which will launch the prototype in that mode. You can close it out and go back to your story. All right, guys, I think I'll try to review more of these questions and try to make sure that I answer them as quickly as possible in the follow-up blog article. I hope I have already answered, a bulk of these questions. But if you still have open questions, you can email. What's the email address they can use?
You guys can email webinars@infragistics.com.
Or you can just email me. It's G Abraham, and let me just pull up that slide. So I should have had my email here, but I don't. It's just gabraham@infragistics.com. But if you have product ideas or you're curious about what about this particular feature, what about that feature, you can always go to indigostudio.uservoice.com. which is actually our public facing side of our idea database, right? And you can look at what people have been talking about, what people have been voting on, and see if your ideas are already there for you to contribute, right? Just vote it up, and then it'll make sure that it informs our product planning decision.